I think there are two things that I would say. One is the emphasis given in the discussion we've just had around different ways in which we might get higher levels of rural penetration of broadband and superfast broadband, and the different ways in which that might be attained beyond simply attempting to rely on market forces that have run out of steam by the time they get into rural areas. So I think the discussion around subsidy, community initiatives and so on, ways of pushing broadband and particularly superfast broadband deeper into rural areas through different types of policy intervention was really quite interesting. The second aspect, the second message which I think you've wanted to convey in the workshop, but which to me hasn't really convinced yet, is that you through the survey of internet use of deep rural, soft rural and urban residents, the idea that there is this disadvantaged deep rural group that are unable to use the internet in the same way that it's being used in softer rural or urban areas. I don't really think you've convincingly yet demonstrated that. It shows that there are some differences in rural internet usage, particularly in deep rural areas, but there might be other factors coming into play there about age and the demographics of rural residents. We know that rural residents are older rather than younger compared with urban residents, say. And that has quite a big importance for understanding the distinctive nature of rural internet use.
So you would encourage more analysis?
I think so, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's straying into the question about further analysis, but I do think the data set that's been generated is very rich, and using some deeper analytical techniques. They don't have to be hugely sophisticated, but logit analysis, which is a kind of a regression for binary data, where you've got adoption or non-adoption. And I think would enable you to look at the different roles in which the age structure or the educational structure of the population, as well as clearly the rural or urbanness of people, show the different effects of these on adoption and non-adoption, or different patterns of usage. So that I think is where I would focus on for further analysis.
I think this is a really exciting time for people living in rural areas, because the government has launched a number of initiatives to extend coverage of broadband, both 2 megabits per second and superfast broadband across the UK. And is also doing the same with mobile coverage, and we've got 4G mobile now rolling out to 98% of the population. So with all that in the background, it's really interesting to understand what people in rural areas are looking for out of these new services, and how they're going to use these new services, because I think we have very little information on that area. So the seminar was really useful in crystallising some of these issues and asking some really important questions.
Could you just expose maybe a few, like some
well,
use areas or?
So one of the things coming out is the cause and effect. So are people moving to rural areas in order that because they want to work in a beautiful part of the UK and they want to work from home, and therefore they're demanding better networks, better communication services? Or is it that people are living in rural areas feel disenfranchised and they are lobbying for better connected services because they already feel as though they're excluded from many things going on? And I get the sense that both of these things are going on at the same time. But it would be very interesting to dig deeper and find out what's driving this.
I'm a relative newcomer to the world of telecoms, so I found today's session and the Oxus report extremely fascinating as a piece of research. I suppose I was slightly disappointed in that it seemed to be just covering Great Britain and excluded Northern Ireland, and my plea would be for future surveys to include Northern Ireland, because I think it would strengthen the body of research. It would make the findings that more robust and give it a UK perspective. Having said that, I don't think the findings that are in the current report would be that radically different if Northern Ireland were included. I think the challenges we face, certainly in our rural community, would be similar to those elsewhere in the UK. So in that sense, I found it extremely fascinating. I found the discussion on the rural-urban divide extremely relevant to Northern Ireland in that sense. I thought the categories of solution, whether it was subsidy or whatever, certainly had a resonance with me. It's something that we probably haven't fully explored, and I suppose one of the things I'll take away today is to have some further thoughts on what we should intervene in and how we should actually intervene, particularly in those deep rural areas, the hard to reach areas, the final 10% as it's commonly referred to. It's a particular issue in Northern Ireland because of the dispersed nature of our population.
I think what we've found and presented today is that there are significant and real differences in internet use and internet access and perceptions of the internet between what we call deep rural areas on the one hand and shallow rural and urban areas on the other hand. So I think difference has emerged from our findings. That's probably the key point. And then the question of what that means and how we might address that.
I thought the important item here was there's a real issue here in rural areas that has to do with how rural people are able to get access to the internet. The deep rural, shallow rural distinction seems to be where it's at, that in rural areas that are near urban centers, in other words, shallow rural areas, there seems to be very little difference between internet access and use in those areas and internet use in urban areas. When you get into remote rural regions, there's a major difference in what people do. And that distinction is important because there are more people who live in these deep rural areas than there actually are unemployed people in Britain right now. So it's a big number, about 1.6 million people, and having lack of access to the internet is a big issue for them.
The most important theme that came out of this workshop is the degree to which we can be fairly definitive about the rural divide in Britain. Anecdotally, people know that there's a difference between urban and rural access to the internet. But we've for the first time, been able to really show through survey evidence that there is a rural divide, and it's not what everyone expected. We found the major divide between people who live in deep rural areas and people who live in shallow rural areas. And people who live in shallow urban areas are often as connected, if not more connected, than people in urban areas. And so some of the earlier studies of the divide actually lost the signal about what was going on because they combined various areas of rural Britain. So what we have is a large enough sample of rural residents stratified by deep rural and shallow rural, and so that we can really identify the divide. And people in deep rural areas of the UK are being able to access the internet, but at lower speeds. And therefore we find that where the real divide happens is in how people use the internet. Because they have lower speeds, they're not using it for social networking, for music, entertainment, for applications that require higher bandwidth. But they are using it for things that really do not require higher bandwidth, checking the news, making travel plans, and most people are connected. But whether people know it or not in rural areas, they're using the internet differently, and it's affected by the low-speed internet in deep rural areas of Britain.
The problem I have in answering that is that I don't think you've properly established the fact that deep rural residents are substantially disadvantaged. So the last discussion was premised on having established that, what should be the policy implications, but I don't think you have yet established that it is the case that residents in deep rural areas have got a substantial disadvantage due to the lack of superfast broadband or the lack of broadband provision. I don't think it's yet established that that's the case. There are clearly differences in usage, but it's not clear to me the extent to which those are caused by the absence of good enough broadband. I mean, if we just take one example, if you look at the things like there is a very pronounced rural to urban difference in things like games machines and portable MP3 players. Now, those are clearly not dependent on access to broadband. Those are to do with the different characteristics of deep rural, as opposed to urban people. They don't use games machines, presumably because they're much older. So I still don't think the basic point has been established, and hence the policy implications that would stem from you establishing the point that there is a problem, I don't think you've yet established it. So I would kind of leave it there.
Well, I think there are two big policy areas to be investigated. One is the impact that universal availability is going to have on the economy, on the wider digital economy. So if everybody has access to broadband, then what does that mean for government services? What does that mean for the wider retail economy? And does it mean that rural areas are going to be brought up to the same level as towns and cities? I think the second is a bit more future-looking, which is with the rollout of superfast broadband, is this a service that people actually need at the moment, or is it a luxury? And will the technology develop? Will new applications and services evolve to fill the sort of huge potential of the technology?
Telecommunications policy is a reserved matter. It's still held by the UK government. So as a devolved administration, the powers that Northern Ireland have are limited. We can certainly consider when to intervene and how to intervene. And I think some of the discussion today gave me a lot of food for thought.
There was no single answer to that. There were strong views that opening up the infrastructure to community groups or to other providers could lead to more widespread high-speed connection, superfast connection. That was one strong view. Another view was that actually public subsidy is needed in order to increase the speed of internet access in rural areas, especially deep rural areas, the last 10%. And I think a key point is that there are millions of people involved in this. It isn't just a few households or businesses, but it's a large number of people and a large number of businesses. So those are key points, and how to connect them at a higher speed and involve them in internet use at that level.
If Britain intends to have this major commitment to equity, then certainly this is a concern. Britain needs to provide opportunities for people in deep rural areas to have access to the internet similar to the access that other people in Britain enjoy. So that's a major public policy concern. I think it is, of course, important to ask how you might go about doing that. And I think that's an unresolved question at the end of today. We had a number of interesting suggestions, including a suggestion that The real problem was not that money was not available or that these access could not be extended, but rather that it needed to be done on a basis of loans with more favorable terms than bank loans. So this might have to be something like government guaranteed loans or something like that.
It seems clear to me that where we have found the divide in speed is are areas that are the highest cost and the least market attractive for bringing in higher speed internet access. My own sense is that we should have a more diverse approach technologically, so that we should use a multiplicity of technologies, satellite, wireless, fiber, all sorts of technologies to most appropriately fit the circumstances of a particular area. But another, I think a thrust of the meeting was that probably it will require public subsidy to really reach many of these areas, because they are not going to attract market investment. And therefore it raises questions about, in a time of austerity, can this be done?
Deeper analysis of the data sets you've got, like using a logit analysis to explain better the differences between deep rural and soft rural and urban uses.
If we think beyond the borders of what we discussed in the workshop and the data analysis that was presented there, what's the next big thing that, or are there any things that we've missed out completely and we should look into them in the future?
No. Beyond this interesting question about should you be, in policy terms, should one be going for super fast broadband in deep rural areas as the way forward? And I think the emphasis that's come strongly out of the discussion is that yes, you should. That rather than being limited by going for a 2 megabit kind of interim strategy, that actually going for finding ways, which are going to be difficult and challenging through intervention and regulation probably, of getting super fast broadband out into deep rural areas is perhaps the most important policy conundrum that's going to have to be dealt with over the next 10 or 15 years.
I think one thing that would be really interesting would be to do some sort of segmentation analysis of people living in remote rural areas, and try and, because we know some very interesting things about them already. For instance, if you're older, you're more likely to be older, but you're also more likely to take up the internet and use the internet, even if you're older, than people living in towns and cities. So I think it would be really interesting to sort of conduct some form of segmentation to understand what these different groups are and what their needs and aspirations are and how they can be served in the future by policymakers.
Would that be a call for more qualitative?
Well, I think it would be both, because I think you'd need to have the numbers to be able to quantify the size of each group, but obviously you'd need to have the qualitative side, interviewing these people and finding out, getting under the skin of what they want and what their needs are.
As I say, I'm a relative newcomer, so I don't feel particularly well able to answer that. Certainly locally, there's a dearth of research as to the situation in Northern Ireland, and where I would like to see the Oxus report in the future is to include Northern Ireland in some form or fashion, so that I can draw on it as a body of research to help inform our future strategic direction.
Well, as an academic, I would say there was more than one, of course, but I think one key issue that was raised was future-proofing, and how do we know that the levels of broadband we're talking about now and that the government is providing or seeking to provide, are they the right levels for the future? So probably not. They're probably inadequate in terms of future-proofing, 5 years, 10 years and so on. So if you want the UK to be a leader in Europe, as government says, we need to look at much higher speed, 4G, 5G, 6G and so on. And the means to do that in rural areas in particular is not clear.
Well, today a lot of interesting things came out as far as research is concerned. I think the first one to look at is do a very serious set of multivariate analyses, controlling for things like age and education and income and so on, and make sure that this deep rural, shallow rural distinction holds up. Now, it has held up in the existing analyses that we've done, so there's every reason to think it will continue to, but clearly that's a place to go forward. Furthermore, I think we need to look at some other possibilities, whether it's possible to add access to the data that we currently have. In other words, the postcode data from Ofcom that could provide coverage in individual postcodes. So we could relate access to the internet to people's actual experience on the internet. The strength of access is, of course, it gives personal experiences of individuals and their attitudes and opinions. And if we link that to the sort of background structural issues like their access and perhaps population density and a few of the other interesting variables like that we could get off of census, I think that would make for a very interesting research project.
One idea for future research is that we maybe do more small-scale quantitative and qualitative work. For example, by surveying Britain, we can identify the deep rural divide in speed, but everyone wants more accurate information. People think that much of the data that's been looked at in the past, and even our survey, might actually overestimate access because there are, even in an area that has access, there are pockets of individuals who don't. And so maybe there's a potential for future research to look at a fairly well-subscribed area, or even all the people connected to a particular hub, to see exactly in more detail a micro view of an embedded case study of the households in a particular urban area and rural area that would help us identify who's really being left off, or what speeds people actually have. But again, that's expensive. It's difficult to generalize from that, and I think our survey research pretty definitively alerts people to this divide, and it should facilitate the development and prioritizing of public policy, even on the basis of the data we have.